When we think about the Industrial Revolution, we usually get this picture of a glorious, unstoppable wave of progress, right? A world of steam and steel and brilliant inventions that built the modern age. But like any big story, the one we usually hear, well, it's only part of the truth. So let's start by looking at how this shiny vision of progress was sold to the world.
Okay, take a look at this. This image from the year 1900 just perfectly nails that triumphant feeling. It's called Dawn of the Century. And right there in the center, you've got this goddess-like figure, an angel of progress, holding the flag of the new era. She's sitting on a winged wheel, literally flying into the future, and she's surrounded by all the signs of modernity. Railways, cameras, factories, printing presses. This was the dream they were selling.
And if you thought that was on the nose, check this one out. From a trade magazine, it's called Two Magicians. Up top, there's Aladdin from the Orient, who, built a palace with a magic lamp. But below him is the real hero of the story, the modern mechanic from the Occident. With his tools, he's weaving a new kind of magic, a more powerful one, building bridges, skyscrapers, massive ships. The message couldn't be clearer. The past was just a fairy tale. The future was all about engineering.
So this was the promise of a new world, a triumphant story of rapid, amazing technological change. But behind these really powerful images were the lives of millions of people whose reality was, well, a lot more complicated. And that brings up a really crucial question. Was this progress for everyone?
To find the answer, we actually need to rewind a bit. We've got to look back to a time before the giant factories and the smoke-filled skies that we always associate with industrialization, because it turns out, long before the first factory ever roared to life, a different kind of industrial production was already happening, and on a massive scale.
Historians have a great name for this, proto-industrialization. Basically, it was a system where merchants, who were based in towns, would supply money to peasants and artisans way out in the countryside. These rural families would then produce goods, a lot of the time right from their own homes, for this huge international market. And listen, this wasn't just some small-time crafting. This was large-scale production, just without a factory in sight. This illustration shows you exactly how it worked. I mean, look at this. You can see an entire family involved in spinning yarn right there in their cottage. This usually wasn't their only job either. It was a way to bring in some extra cash to supplement their farming, especially as a lot of the old common lands were disappearing. For many people, this system was an absolute lifeline. And the system itself was a well-oiled machine, just not a mechanical one. The merchants in the towns, they controlled the whole network. They'd provide the raw materials and the money, the rural families would do the production work, and then the final finishing touches would be put on in cities like London. London actually became known as a finishing center, and from there, the goods were shipped out all over the world.
All right, so this brings us to a major myth about the Industrial Revolution, this idea that it was some sudden, overnight transformation. The reality? The shift to a machine-based economy was incredibly gradual, and those traditional ways of working, they stuck around for a very, very long time.
Now, this might surprise you, but even deep into the 19th century, the typical worker was not standing at some giant machine in a factory. Nope, they were a traditional craftsperson or a manual laborer. In fact, less than 20% of the workforce was even employed in the so-called technologically advanced sectors. Hand labor was still king. So why was the change so slow? Well, there were a few key reasons. First off, there was no shortage of cheap labor. Why would you invest in a huge, expensive machine when human hands were plentiful and cheap? Second, a lot of industries were seasonal, so it just made more sense to hire temporary workers when you needed them than to have giant machines sitting idle all year. Plus, the new technology was super expensive, it was unreliable, and it cost a fortune to repair. And finally, let's not forget the upper classes. The rich folks, the aristocrats, they still preferred the refinement and, the status of unique, handmade goods. And this caution is perfectly summed up by the story of the steam engine itself, the ultimate symbol of the industrial age. James Watt patented his improved version way back in 1781, but for years, he couldn't find a single buyer. Industrialists just weren't convinced it was worth the money and the hassle.
How cautious were they? Well, let me just throw a number at you. At the very beginning of the 19th century, there were only 321 steam engines in use across all of England. That's it. So this whole idea of a sudden dramatic technological revolution, it just doesn't really hold up. The change was slow and it was really uneven. Okay, now we need to zoom out, because you cannot tell the story of industrialization in Britain without talking about its empire. The rise of British factories was deeply and, tragically connected to the collapse of industry in places like India.
So on the left here, we see a traditional Indian weaver. Before the British showed up, Indian textiles, especially their fine cottons and silks, absolutely dominated the world market. They were the best. Then, on the right, you had the port of Bombay, which really symbolizes the new colonial order. We're literally looking at the world that was lost and the one that came to replace it.
And the numbers, they tell a devastating story. Back in the 1750s, Indian merchants were running this thriving trade, but once the East India Company established political control, everything changed. By 1812, textiles still made up a third of India's exports, but just a few decades later, by 1850, look at that number, it had plummeted to a mere 3%.
So what this meant was that Indian weavers were hit with a double blow. It was a total nightmare. First, their global export market just vanished. And then their own local market was flooded with cheap, machine-made cloth that was being imported from Manchester. They were completely trapped, unable to compete at home or abroad.
And listen to this quote from a British census report in 1872. It just gives a voice to that collapse. It describes the Kushtalatis, who were a community of weavers, saying they had fallen upon evil times and were unable to compete with the showy goods which Manchester sends in such profusion. For countless skilled artisans, an entire way of life was just disappearing.
But the human cost of this new age wasn't just felt in the colonies. Back in Britain, in the very heart of the empire, the lives of the workers who were actually powering this revolution were often brutal and incredibly uncertain.
The cities just swelled with people pouring in from the countryside, all desperate for jobs. But there was always more labor than there was work, and that kept wages painfully low and made unemployment a constant nagging threat. For so many people, life became this desperate, nomadic search for the next seasonal job.
This first-hand account from a man named Will Thorne it's incredibly powerful. He describes walking to London to find work, running out of money, and having to sleep in fields. This was not a story of glorious opportunity. For so many, it was a story of grim survival.
And this helps you understand why so many workers weren't exactly celebrating new technology. When the spinning jenny was introduced, it directly threatened the livelihood of women who made a living from hand spinning. Their attacks on the new machines weren't about rejecting progress for its own sake, it was an act of desperation. It was a fight to keep their families fed.
When you look at these two images side by side, the homeless and hungry in London on the left, and female factory workers in Ahmedabad, India on the right, you realize it's a shared story of hardship. Whether you were in the heart of the empire or in its colonies, the engine of industrial progress was being fueled by the really difficult lives of the working poor.
So there is no doubt that the age of industry reshaped our world in profound ways. It absolutely set the stage for the life we know today. But that triumphant story of progress, the one with magicians and angels, it hides the enormous human cost. And it leaves us with one final and, I think, crucial question to think about. Who really paid the price for that change?